A dense forest just steps away from a magnificent waterfall. A paradise on earth, but at the same time, a perfect place to dispose of a body. Who was this woman whose mutilated body was discovered by loggers in December 2016? Who killed her? Why? The mystery of the unknown woman of Les Franois captivated France for months. But thanks to incredible determination and a stroke of luck, investigators were able to first identify the victim and then uncover a killer so unlikely that many were more willing to believe his story, worthy of a detective novel, than accept that he could be a brutal criminal. Les Franois is a small commune in the Jura department in eastern France. This truly verdant area attracts tourists with its stunning lakes and waterfalls. But on December 15, 2016, it was not tourists who were destined to make a chilling discovery, but hard-working loggers. While working, one of them descended into a steep ravine and noticed something pink beneath the leaves. The man bent down and brushed the leaves aside. At first, he thought he had found a piglet that had escaped from a nearby farm, but to his horror, he then recognized human toes. The loggers quickly notified the police about the body they had found. Since Les Franois has virtually no police presence, investigators from Besançon took over the case. The location where the body was discovered was 50 meters from the road in an especially steep ravine. The body lay under a tree, completely hidden by leaves and branches. Had it not been for the loggers, who were short on firewood, the body might have remained undiscovered for a long time. The body belonged to a young woman between the ages of 15 and 25. The victim lay on her back, naked, her nudity revealing numerous stab wounds. However, the face had suffered the most damage. It was horribly disfigured, with a dislocated jaw and broken teeth. Identification through facial features was impossible. The only distinctive feature of the victim was her red hair. There were no tattoos, piercings, or surgical scars. Aside from a woven bracelet on her wrist, there was nothing. No clue to help the police establish her identity. At the scene, there was almost no blood, which indicated that the body had been brought to the forest after death and that the murder had taken place elsewhere. While the detectives in Besançon were dealing with an unidentified body, the Missing Persons Department was actively searching for a missing girl from the same city. Narumi Kurosaki, a student, had arrived in France from Japan in August 2016 to study French. She had disappeared a few days earlier after having dinner with her ex-boyfriend. Narumi lived in a university dormitory, and on the night of her disappearance, one of her neighbors heard a chilling scream that abruptly stopped. Since Besançon was only an hour's drive from Les Franois, the body found in the forest could have belonged to Narumi. However, the face was so badly disfigured that only DNA testing could confirm this theory. But the DNA samples did not match. The body in the forest was not Narumi's. It couldn't have been that straightforward. Nevertheless, given the victim's age, investigators still believe she might have been a student. And since the body was discovered in December, they hoped the holiday season might provide a lead. Unfortunately, when detectives reviewed the missing persons list in early January, they found no records of any girl who had gone missing in mid-December. The autopsy report revealed that the victim from the forest in Les Franois had suffered 26 stab wounds. The wounds matched a small pocket knife with a short blade. Surprisingly, none of the stab wounds were immediately life-threatening. The victim died from facial trauma caused by a blow from a heavy object, combined with significant blood loss. Determining the exact time of death was challenging, but it was estimated that she had died 5 days before her body was discovered. Before her death, the girl had engaged in sexual intercourse. However, the medical examiner doubted that it was non-consensual. It appeared to have been voluntary. The semen found allowed investigators to extract male DNA. Additionally, a bloodstain was discovered on the victim's foot that did not belong to her. It was likely that the killer had injured himself while stabbing her. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to the same man who had sexual contact with the victim before her death. Meanwhile, officers combed the forest, employing canine units and helicopters. They understood that any early oversights could never be fully rectified, so they approached their task with the utmost diligence. The steep slope presented a significant challenge. As they descended, officers and forensic experts slipped multiple times, instinctively grabbing at trees and bushes to steady themselves. This led them to a realization: if navigating the terrain was difficult for them, it must have been equally challenging for the killer who carried the victim's body. They swabbed all nearby bushes and trees and found DNA matching the semen and blood on the victim's foot. This confirmed that the person who killed her and dumped her body in the ravine was the same individual. Identifying the perpetrator's DNA was a significant breakthrough, but having a name to match the sample would be even better. The DNA was checked against the databases of European countries and Interpol, but no matches were found. Since detectives had neither the victim's identity nor the perpetrators, they found themselves at a dead end. The Forensic Science Research Institute of the French National Gendarmerie contacted the detectives, offering to perform a facial reconstruction of the victim. There were two possible approaches: either send the victim's head directly to the institute or perform a CT scan. Investigators decided against further disturbing the victim's remains. Fortunately, they had the necessary equipment for a computed tomography scan. The institute conducted the facial reconstruction and added red hair, which the victim likely had. The resulting image was distributed through regional and national media outlets. Over 100 calls were received, but none led to any breakthroughs. Meanwhile, media interest in the enigmatic case remained high, and the murder came to be known in the press as the case of the unknown woman from Les Franois. In February, the investigative team was contacted by colleagues from another precinct. They reported a potential suspect, a lumberjack who lived 20 kilometers from Les Franois. 3 years earlier, this bachelor had invited 3 young Bulgarian women to stay with him as housekeepers. However, the women soon went to the police, as the man's intentions were far from cooking and cleaning. He had hidden their passports and attempted to force them into providing intimate services for him and other men. Despite their complaint, no legal action was taken, so the man remained free. Given his profession, he was familiar with all the forests in the region. Investigators wondered, what if the murdered woman was one of those he had invited but had refused to provide the services he demanded? What if she wasn't French but a foreigner? This theory was taken seriously by the team. For an extended period, they monitored the lumberjack, keeping his home under surveillance. Wiretaps on his phone revealed insights into his life. It turned out that he was in frequent contact with a young Bulgarian woman. However, their conversations suggested that this time the man himself was the victim of a romance scam, as the woman repeatedly asked him for money. Eventually, investigators brought the man in for questioning and collected a DNA sample. The sample did not match the DNA found on the victim's body. While the man had complicated relationships with Bulgarian women, he was not the killer. Unbeknownst to the detectives, their hypothesis that the victim was not French had brought them one step closer to uncovering her identity. Given the challenging situation surrounding the identification of both the victim and the perpetrator, detectives sought fresh ideas to move the investigation forward, attempting unconventional methods beyond the scope of traditional investigations. For instance, they knew that in the Jura department, lynx populations were monitored using camera traps. The detectives decided to employ these camera traps in hopes of uncovering something useful. Unfortunately, even these unconventional approaches yielded no results. Months passed, and they remained empty-handed. There were no leads to follow, neither concerning the killer nor the victim, a situation that is exceedingly rare in criminal investigations. This lack of progress deeply frustrated the investigators, leaving them feeling as though they were the only ones who cared about solving the murder of this young woman. Surely someone should have been searching for her, either in France or another country, but no such efforts materialized. A breakthrough in the case occurred, as often happens, when no one expected it anymore. Over a casual coffee conversation between a French gendarme and a Swiss colleague. What do two police officers talk about? Naturally, their work. In January 2017, one of the detectives working on the case of the unknown woman from Les Franois traveled to Switzerland for professional reasons. During a coffee break, he shared details about the body found in the forest near the waterfall. The Swiss officer promised to keep the information in mind if they came across an unsolved case of a missing woman. In March 2017, the Swiss colleague unexpectedly reached out to the French detective with new information. He mentioned that the Swiss authorities were investigating a prostitution network operating illegally in Lausanne. One of the women involved had gone missing. Her name was Mihaela Miloiu. But that wasn't all the Swiss detective had uncovered. On December 2, 2016, a woman walking her dog in the commune of Sullens, 15 kilometers north of Lausanne, found an ID card on the road next to a large bloodstain about 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. A little further along, she also noticed a condom and lubricant. The woman took a photo of the bloodstain and took the ID to the police. The document was issued in the name of Mihaela Miloiu. Unfortunately, the Swiss police took no action to investigate this case. It was a missed opportunity, as had they pursued the matter back then, the French police would not have wasted 6 months trying to identify the unknown woman from Les Franois. Now that the police had become interested in Mihaela's identity, they contacted the witness, and the woman showed them the spot where she had found the ID and blood. However, there was an obvious problem. 6 months had passed, during which the road had been exposed to various weather conditions: rain, wind, snow, and ice. Nevertheless, the police decided to take a risk and extract DNA from the concrete. This was a rare procedure, but thanks to the porous nature of the cement, which absorbs blood, it was possible. Forensic specialists used a perforator to remove several fragments of the concrete and examine them. They were incredibly fortunate. They managed to find female DNA. The result was sent to the French colleagues in the form of a sequence of letters and numbers, which the detective quickly compared with the DNA of the unknown woman from Les Franois. The samples matched. To rule out any possibility of error, the investigators asked their Romanian colleagues to take DNA samples from Mihaila's parents, and those too matched the blood on the road and the woman found in the forest. The unknown woman was no longer unknown. Her name was Mihaela Miloiu. Mihaela was born in Romania into a family of modest means. She, her parents, and her older brother lived in a village 200 kilometers from Bucharest at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. Despite their difficult financial situation, her parents wanted to provide their daughter with a better future than they had. They sent Mihaela to school in the city of Câmpulung. At first, everything was going great. The girl was studying well and showing good progress. However, unfortunately, this very school was a hunting ground for a certain Dafinel Bocanu. The young man was slightly older than Mihaela, but he had a lot of experience in seducing classmates and older girls. 15-year-old Mihaela fell in love with Dafinel and soon packed her things and moved in with him, despite her mother's protests and pleas. Dafinel took her to restaurants, to the hairdresser for manicures, and bought her some gifts. Nothing extraordinary, but for Mihaela, who had previously lived very modestly, this was a whole new side of life. The poor girl didn't realize that Dafinel had long perfected his approach with girls aged 15, 16. He played the role of a charming prince, drawing schoolgirls to him and then trapping them. After some time, sometimes a year or two, they were offered to take the path of the world's oldest profession. They weren't forced, but promised better financial security. When Mihaela's parents found out what Dafinel was forcing their daughter to do, they were horrified. Her mother tried to bring Mihaela back home and even went to the school, but Mihaela simply dropped out. Things got worse. Once the girls reached adulthood, they were offered the opportunity to go west, where they could earn much more money. So in October 2016, Mihaela hid from her parents that she was flying to Lausanne, Switzerland. Attracted by the promise of a better life, she joined the prostitution network run by Dafinel's cousin, Lucien Beauchenu. This was the classic path for a sex worker. In Lausanne, the authorities are relatively tolerant towards sex workers, and there are so-called salons where the girls can expect some protection. However, Mihaela didn't work in a salon. She ended up on the streets under the control of clients who, for various reasons, couldn't visit the salons and who could be the most dangerous for the girls. Upon learning where her daughter was working, Mihaela's mother went to the police, but they ignored her. The woman could do nothing more. Mihaela's work lasted only a short time. She arrived in Lausanne just a month and a half before her death. Once the police confirmed that the body was indeed Mihaela's, her parents were allowed to take her home and bury her. After the first breakthrough, the pace of the investigation only accelerated. The police were able to determine the exact time of Mihaela's death, thanks to the phone tapping that had been carried out by the Swiss police for a long time. Mihaela died much earlier than they had initially thought, on the night of November 29, 30, when her phone stopped working. That evening at 11 p.m., Mihaela was in Lausanne working when she received a call from Lucien Beauchenu, who told her that she had worked enough and could come for dinner. Mihaela replied that she would work a bit longer. The next call Mihaela made was at 0:50 a.m. when she called the emergency services, but the call was interrupted. At that moment, she was in Lausanne on the outskirts of the city. Then her phone moved to Solins, where a woman walking her dog had found a patch of blood and an ID. Finally, at 2 a.m., someone turned off Mihaela's phone on the border between Switzerland and France. Now that the victim's identity and time of death were established, the focus could shift to finding the murderer. Who was he? A pimp? A client? The police had a clue of blood on Mihaela's foot. The detectives believed the killer had cut himself. Therefore, they sent out requests to hospitals in the region and received a list of people who could be of interest. Specifically, they were looking for knife cuts. That's when they learned that on November 30th, 2016, at 6:50 a.m., a man with a cut on the index finger of his right hand came into the emergency room of the Pontarlier Hospital, located 50 kilometers southeast of Besançon. He told the doctor that he had hit a deer while driving home. The deer was still alive, so the man used a pocket knife to put it out of its misery. However, his hand slipped and he cut himself. The man received 1 or 2 stitches on his finger. This clumsy motorist was named Alexandre Verdure. Alexandre, 30 years old, lives not far from the location where the body was found, with his girlfriend and their young son. The couple is planning to have a second child. As for his work, he is a security officer in Lausanne. Additionally, he is a reserve police officer. He has also worked as an ambulance driver and a volunteer firefighter. Overall, Alexandre didn't seem to fit the profile of a criminal. On the contrary, it was clear that he loved helping people. However, investigators were unsettled by the examination of his phone. On the night of November 29, 30, his phone was turned off from 1:57 a.m. to 4 a.m. During this time, his girlfriend tried to call him 17 times. Clearly, she was puzzled by his phone being turned off. After all, he had never turned off his phone that year except for that night. The timeline suggested that Alexandre turned off his phone shortly before the murder and turned it back on in the hospital in Pontarlier. These were circumstantial pieces of evidence, but the police still decided to arrest Alexandre. A DNA sample was immediately taken from him. During the interrogation, the man denied everything. He claimed he didn't know Mihaela, hadn't killed her, and had no connection to the case. Alexandre's parents were convinced that it was a mistake and that their son would be released any minute. All of Alexandre's friends and acquaintances rallied around him. No one for a second believed that he could have committed the murder. However, the result of the DNA comparison came back. It matched. Alexandre's DNA was found on the intimate parts of the woman's body, under her nails, on her foot, and on branches of trees and bushes in the forest where the body was discovered. Alexandre was charged with the murder of Mihaela. Soon after the charges were brought against him, Alexandre wrote a letter to the investigating judge, presenting a new version of events, which differed from what he had stated during his arrest. In the letter, he explained that on November 29, 2016, he finished work at 11:30 p.m. and drove home. On the outskirts of Lausanne, as he was about to join the highway leading to the French border, he saw a man attacking a woman about 50 meters ahead of him. The man was beating the woman and dragging her, seemingly intending to abduct her. Alexandre rushed to help. Upon seeing him, the man ran away. The woman got into Alexandre's car and told him that she was a street worker, a night butterfly. She offered to thank him for his help. Alexandre hesitated but agreed. They found a dimly lit stretch of road in Soulens, the spot where 3 days later, a woman walking her dog would find blood and the woman's ID. After Mihaela thanked Alexandre and they were getting dressed, a black car arrived. Two men got out. It seemed that they had been watching them. Alexandre believed they were pimps. One of the men was armed. Threatening Alexandre with a gun, they searched his bag and found his pocket knife. Using Alexandre's knife, they killed Mihaela. They then told him that either he would dispose of the body or his girlfriend, parents, and child would be in danger, as they had seen his ID, his police credentials, and his home address. After that, the men left. Mihaela lay on the ground. She was dead. Alexandre saw his own knife in her neck. He cut himself while removing the knife. The man put Mihaela's body in the trunk and crossed the border. He decided that, as a police officer, he was obligated to report the crime. However, in the rearview mirror, he noticed the black car of the killers following him. He realized that once he disposed of the body, they would kill him too. So on a turn toward the juror department, he broke free from them. In the woods, he undressed the girl because, as he claimed, the bushes were snagging on her clothes, and it was hindering him from descending into the ravine with the body. In the ravine, he covered her nakedness with leaves and branches, out of modesty, of course. Alexandre concluded his statement, explaining that he had not killed Mihaela. He just wanted to protect his girlfriend, parents, and child. He believed that if he had spoken at any point, the criminals would have found him, and he couldn't take that risk. He simply had no choice. Alexandre's new version seemed more like the product of a vivid imagination, a movie plot rather than real life. However, since he did not fit the profile of a brutal killer, investigators took his claims seriously and checked every word of his story. At first glance, the version about vengeful pimps punishing a rebellious prostitute seemed worthy of attention. It was revealed that 3 days before the murder, Mihaela had told her mother that she wanted to return to her parents in Romania. Moreover, the head of the Beauchenu clan had a reputation for being a very violent man. There were known instances when girls were brutally beaten, their jaws broken, if they didn't earn enough money or if a client had cheated them. However, accusing the pimps in his letter, Alexandre did not know that all calls made by the clan members had long been wiretapped and recorded by Swiss police. Therefore, the officers knew for sure that the only phone in Soulens, the location of the murder, was Mihaela's. The pimps' phones were located at least 7 kilometers away from the crime scene. As for Dafino Beauchenu, the young man who had seduced Mihaela, he was in Romania and had been summoned to court as a defendant. The other members of the group had been calling each other on the day of the murder and in the following days, actively discussing Mihaela's absence. Initially, they had assumed that the girl had decided to take some time off. The head of the Beauchenu clan, Lucien, was worried about her absence. He said it was crucial to find Mihaela because she brought in thousands of euros every day, and taking a vacation was out of the question. However, after a few days, they realized that something had happened to her and began actively searching for her. Police work results showed that there was no other suspect besides Alexandra. Once the police ruled out the last client of the girl and the pimps, it became clear that only Alexandra could be guilty. However, the police and the investigating judge still conducted a reconstruction of the crime, starting with the supposed attack on Mihaela, which Alexandra claimed to have intervened in. His story failed to withstand scrutiny from the very beginning. From his car, driving on the highway, he could not have seen the attack on the girl because it happened too far away from him. Even with the headlights on, it was too dark. The behavior of the pimps was also illogical. Why would the killers search the witness's bag for a possible murder weapon and then kill Mihaela with a small pocket knife, stabbing her 26 times? Why would they leave the police witness alive, even if he was a reservist? Investigators had never heard of a case where a police officer had been left alive after witnessing a murder. Finally, even if Alexandra was afraid to go to the police, he could have hidden some evidence in case officers came after him. But it was he who had the idea to undress the girl completely and dispose of the murder weapon. Alexandra explained this by claiming that he simply made a mistake. However, detectives were sure that Alexandra destroyed the evidence because he was the murderer. The trial took place in December 2020 in Besançon. The prosecutor demanded a 30-year prison sentence. Alexandra stood by his version of events. Many of his acquaintances, colleagues, and relatives came to support him, stating that he wouldn't hurt a fly. However, his girlfriend, who took the witness stand, admitted that recently he had shown more aggression, even rudeness. Conflicts had escalated to the point where she had refused intimacy with him. As a result, the man had begun seeking the services of prostitutes. Experts also testified in court, having conducted a forensic psychological evaluation of the defendant. The portrait of Alexandra they painted was far from flattering. They unanimously stated that he had a strong desire to appear as a hero, a savior, and that he exhibited a grandiose sense of self-importance. The slightest hint of mockery or humiliation provoked aggression. This, they suggested, might explain the murder. He could have told Mihaela something about himself, perhaps boasting about his job or his police reservist badge, which she might have mocked. Or the intimate encounter may not have gone as he had hoped. Without his confession, we would never know. But most likely, something triggered his rage. The experts also agreed that Alexandra was very dangerous and that there was a high risk of recidivism. He was found guilty. The prosecutor insisted on a 30-year sentence, but the court sentenced him to 20 years in prison. Mihaela's family was not present at the trial. They simply did not have the means to attend. They had to borrow money to bring their daughter's body home and bury her. However, they believed it was right that the killer was convicted and would serve his punishment. On the other hand, Alexandra's family disagreed with the verdict. He appealed the sentence, and his parents hired a private investigator who tried to point to alternative suspects, Mihaela's pimps. They claimed that the girl had wanted to return to Romania and was punished for it. The family sought to prove that the police had not thoroughly examined all the evidence, and thus the court's verdict was unfair. The appellate court hearing took place in September 2021. Alexandra's family came well prepared. In addition to the findings of the private investigator, they invited an activist from a Romanian movement supporting sex workers who was convinced that Mihaela's murder was a signature of criminal gangs. She argued that this was their modus operandi. However, despite all the efforts made by Alexandra's family, they were unable to secure his release. Moreover, the appellate court increased the sentence from 20 to 30 years in prison, which had originally been requested by the prosecutor. The attempt to challenge the verdict only resulted in an additional 10 years of incarceration. Alexandre Verdure still maintains his innocence, and his lawyer is exploring the possibility of a case review, but at the moment there is no new evidence to cast doubt on his guilt. As for justice in Romania, the authorities successfully arrested and punished members of the Beauchenu clan for human trafficking. Lucien and Daphne were sentenced to 12 and 9 years in prison, respectively. Of the 8 members of the clan, only one did not face punishment, as he was a minor at the time of the crimes. It was the afternoon of November 15, 2001, in Austin, Texas, a place where the sun shines nearly 300 days a year. But this was not one of those days. Something ominous filled the air. Suddenly, the wind began to pick up. Ominous black clouds rolled in, completely blotting out the light. In an instant, day turned into night, and a torrential downpour unleashed, accompanied by deafening claps of thunder and blinding flashes of lightning. Such a storm hadn't been seen in Austin in at least 7 years. As if that wasn't enough, a tornado warning was issued, announcing its approach to the city. At the same time, in her cozy home office in the northwest suburbs, 43-year-old Diane Holick, a project manager at IBM, was working. When her friend warned her that a tornado was heading her way, Diane was terrified. Having grown up in New York, she had never experienced anything like it. Nevertheless, she reassured her friend that she wouldn't leave the house and that she would be fine. The storm raged and roared throughout the night. By morning, the rain had finally stopped pounding against the windows. The sky cleared and everything became eerily quiet. Residents rushed to contact their loved ones to check on how they had weathered the storm, but no one was able to reach Diane. Her friend and neighbor, Lackey Brown, a real estate agent, went to her house, but no one answered the door. By noon, a colleague from Dallas had called Diane 8 times. A video conference was scheduled at work, and Diane hadn't joined. Diane would never have reached such a high-ranking position without being a responsible person, so her colleague grew increasingly concerned that the tornado might have damaged her home or injured Diane. She contacted the police. Lackey Brown noticed the arrival of police officers and, since she had a key to the house, offered to let them in. The moment she stepped inside, a chill ran down her spine. Something was clearly wrong. The carpet showed signs that Diane's dogs hadn't been walked for a long time, something she would never have allowed. Lackey's instinct was correct. Upstairs in the guest bedroom, they discovered the lifeless body of the homeowner. Detectives from the homicide division immediately noticed that, compared to other crime scenes, this one was surprisingly clean. Everything was in its place, and one had to walk into the bedroom and even around the bed to spot the victim. Diane's body lay at an odd angle, as if someone had tried to hide it under the bed but failed. The doors were locked and the windows were undisturbed. Diane was fully clothed, with no signs of sexual assault. Moreover, she still wore some of her jewelry. The scene was so unusual that the detectives initially struggled to believe it was a murder. They speculated that Diane might have taken her own life, and that a friend or relative had found her, arranged her body in that position, and tidied up the house to shield her family from emotional trauma. However, a closer examination of the body revealed a far more horrifying reality. Diane's hands bore marks from zip ties, and her neck showed a deep ligature mark from strangulation. Near the bedroom, mascara and lipstick smudges were found on the carpet, and her cheek had an abrasion consistent with being dragged across the floor. This suggested that the killer, whoever they were, had restrained Diane with zip ties, strangled her near the bedroom, and then dragged her body into the room. Afterward, they meticulously cleaned the house. But one thing disrupted the immaculate scene: a towel left on a chair by the front door. Forensic experts took it for analysis, though they feared it might not be enough to lead them to the killer. When a beautiful woman is killed, investigations often begin by looking into the men close to her. With her enchanting smile and almost childlike openness, Diane Holick drew people to her like a magnet. She had many friends, both men and women, but Diane always valued her independence and self-sufficiency, avoiding overly serious relationships. However, after turning 40, Diane decided she wanted to get married and start a family like many of her friends. That's when she met Dennis Conley, a divorced father of 2 and a successful businessman who had recently relocated to Houston. He treated Diane like a queen, genuinely cared for her, and soon asked the question she had been dreaming of. Diane happily agreed to marry him and decided to sell her home to move to Houston. Diane enlisted the help of her friend, Lackey Brown, but the real estate market was struggling. On Friday, the day after Diane's murder, Dennis left her numerous messages. On one hand, it seemed like he was deeply concerned. On the other, could he have been creating an alibi for himself? After several unsuccessful attempts by police to contact Dennis, detectives began to wonder if he might be connected to the murder. Suspicion grew when they learned that one of the few missing items was Dennis's gift to Diane, a platinum ring worth $20,000. When police finally reached Dennis, he came to Austin immediately. He answered questions clearly and with apparent honesty. He admitted that he and Diane had experienced difficulties in their relationship because she was too independent. They had even decided to postpone the wedding, but they were seeing a couples counselor and had been resolving their issues. Dennis willingly provided fingerprints and a DNA sample. He stated that he had spoken to Diane on the phone the day of her murder, but had spent the evening in Houston. Dennis added that he couldn't think of anyone who might bear a grudge against Diane, but suggested the police talk to her colleague Ray, who had never hidden his feelings for her. Raphael Chauncey, or Ray, didn't need to be found. The worried colleague showed up at the crime scene on his own, claiming he couldn't reach Diane and had come to check on her. Detectives were immediately suspicious of how eager Ray was to assist the investigation. He seemed to go out of his way to be helpful. During questioning, Ray openly admitted that he was very fond of Diane, but she did not feel the same way. Diane had recently confided to a friend that she needed to create some distance between herself and Ray because his persistent attention was beginning to cross boundaries. Still, Diane saw Ray more often than her fiancé as they worked together. When she traveled, Ray even walked her dogs, which meant he had a key to her house. But Ray also had an alibi. On Thursday, the day of the murder, he was at work, and this was fully corroborated. Having ruled out one suspect, detectives turned their focus back to Diane's fiancé, especially after he did something unimaginable that alienated all of Diane's loved ones against him. While the investigation was ongoing, the day came to bid farewell to Diane. Her parents transported her body to New York. No one anticipated what would happen next. Dennis arrived accompanied by a priest and, without saying a word to anyone, conducted a wedding ceremony with the late Diane, placing a gold ring on her finger. Afterward, he didn't speak to any of Diane's relatives or friends present at the service. This enraged her parents, who removed the ring from their daughter's finger. They were furious, and Diane's friends became more convinced of Dennis's involvement in her murder. However, as bizarre as his actions seemed, Dennis was also proven innocent. His alibi was confirmed, showing he spent the day of the murder in Houston. The investigation hit a dead end until Diane's colleague provided a lead. She recalled Diane mentioning that she might have found a buyer for her house. Even if she had moved to Houston to join her fiancé, Diane still wanted to find a smaller home. So her house was still listed for sale on the day she died. Diane had told her colleague about a potential buyer who had visited her. He was dressed expensively and seemed harmless, so she wasn't afraid to let him in without a realtor. The man had sold a ranch and planned to pay Diane in cash from the sale proceeds. He promised to return later with his wife, assuring Diane that his wife would also love the house. Thus, the police had a new suspect. The question now was how to find him. Investigators theorized that the potential buyer might have visited other houses in the same area. They were right. About 7 women reported that, on the day of the murder, a man had come to see their homes, asking to view them without a realtor. When these witnesses were invited to the station and the women started entering one by one, the detectives were astonished. It was like a parade of very beautiful, similar-looking women of about the same age. It became clear that the suspect had a specific type and was targeting women who stayed home with children while their husbands or boyfriends were at work. The stakes grew significantly higher, as the police now believed they were looking for a dangerous stranger. Most of the women had turned the man away, but one of them, a realtor herself, had not been afraid to let him in. She quickly regretted her decision. The man seemed nervous, didn't turn on lights, and avoided opening doors as if he wasn't particularly interested in the house. Then he went upstairs and kept calling her to join him, asking various questions. The woman realized he was trying to lure her into her own bedroom. She shouted her answers from downstairs, steadfastly refusing to go up. Eventually, the stranger left, but he gave her his name, Walter Miller, and a phone number. While the woman helped create a composite sketch, the police checked the name in their databases. The database search revealed 2 Walter Millers, but both were far too old to be the suspect. A check of the phone number, however, provided a more interesting lead. The phone actually belonged to a man named Matt Sapowski, who had a record of domestic violence and drug charges. Detectives went to Matt's home, confident they had found their suspect, but discovered a man who was practically immobile. Sometime before the murder, Matt had been in a car accident, leaving him incapacitated and physically incapable of killing Diane. Fortunately, the work on the composite sketch paid off. 10 minutes after it was shown on TV, a woman called to report that the man had visited her home as well. This had happened 6 months earlier, and he had been very insistent about entering. She refused and he left, but he returned a few months later. Once again, the woman refused to let him in without a realtor, which enraged him. The stranger yelled at her, but she stood her ground. Frightened by the incident, the woman grabbed a pen and paper after he left and wrote down the license plate number of his car. The car was registered to 37-year-old Anthony Russo. At first glance, Russo didn't look like a suspect. A married father of 2, he played in a Christian music band and performed at church. However, this same Tony Russo had a history of multiple assaults on women whom he had attempted to strangle. He had been sentenced to 20 years for one of these incidents, but was released early after serving only 8 years. Detectives went to speak with Russo. Unsurprisingly, he didn't live on a ranch, but in a small, modest house outside Austin. He agreed to come in for questioning, and while he was at the station, the police conducted a search of his home. They found nothing to link him to Diane's murder. At the station, Russo explained that on Thursday at 4 p.m., he had driven to Austin to visit a Christian radio station to promote his band. He said he knocked, but no one answered, so he left. Russo denied looking at new houses and didn't react when shown Diane's photo. The police had no choice but to release him. However, when they spoke to the radio station manager, he said he knew Russo but hadn't seen him that day. Moreover, considering the approaching tornado, it would have been impossible to miss a visitor. According to protocol, upon hearing a tornado warning, everyone in the building was required to go to the lobby and open the doors to equalize the internal pressure. The entrance was clearly visible, and if anyone had approached the radio station, they would have been noticed. So, Russo lied, and the police were able to detain him. It was a minor offense, but it allowed the police to proceed with the case without fearing that he might attack someone else, and they got lucky. Another young mother called the police and stated that she might have evidence against the suspect. When her husband was at work, a man knocked on her door with a flyer about selling her house. He asked if he could come in, and she let him. He was polite, asking about the dog, security systems, and children. They walked through the house, and when they entered the bedroom, he suddenly turned toward her. In an instant, he transformed from a person into a monster. His eyes gave him away. The woman was certain he was preparing to attack her when the baby monitor emitted the sound of a child crying. The woman abruptly turned and rushed to her child. The stranger followed her, but seeing the baby in her arms, he bolted, leaving behind an important piece of evidence. Acting on instinct, the woman put the flyer in a drawer, and when she saw the police sketch, she called the authorities. Tony Russo claimed he never scouted any houses and that his fingerprints wouldn't appear anywhere. But laboratory analysis proved otherwise. The flyer bore 4 fingerprints belonging to Tony Russo, and this young mother could have been his first victim. The women whom Russo had approached under the pretense of viewing real estate identified him. His phone's ping connected him to the area near Diane's house. Additionally, a towel found in her home contained several hairs. While they lacked roots, making a 100% definitive DNA analysis impossible, partial DNA analysis matched Russo's DNA. However, the suspect didn't confess to anything, and prosecutors feared that this evidence might not be enough for a conviction. Then investigators had an idea. They discovered Russo had been searching for homes for sale on the internet. Examining his computer revealed far more than they had expected. They established Russo's motive. As it turned out, he frequented some rather disturbing websites. Specifically, he had a paid subscription to a highly specific website showcasing the realization of men's darkest erotic fantasies. The last video he watched on the site depicted a man, under the guise of purchasing real estate, entering a woman's house and strangling her, deriving intimate pleasure from the act of killing. The man then stole her jewelry, staging the murder as a botched robbery. At Anthony Russo's trial, the prosecutor gave an emotional account of what likely happened that day. Russo, he argued, first visited Diane on Thursday morning, telling her he would return later with his wife. Indeed, he returned during the storm, bringing everything he needed for the attack. Diane, of course, let him in and offered him a towel to dry his hair. Suddenly, he attacked her from behind and bound her with zip ties so she couldn't fight back. His victim must have waited in terror as he prepared his murder weapon, some type of rope or similar object. Then he strangled her. Raising his hands as if holding someone by the neck, the prosecutor asked the jury to vividly imagine what had happened that day. Tied up, Diane couldn't fight back, couldn't scratch his hands or defend herself. He held her for at least 2.5 to 3 minutes, watching as life left her body with each passing second. Imagine how long that took and what she must have felt in those moments of maiden day. The jurors imagined this horrifying scene and found Anthony Russo guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole until he is 93 years old. All his appeals were unsuccessful, and he continues to serve his sentence in prison. It is heartbreaking to realize that Diane's openness, friendliness, and kindness led to such a tragic outcome. However, it is truly admirable how, in this case, several women, strangers to one another, but united by their encounters with a predator scouting for his next victim, came together to prevent him from harming anyone else. If not for the women who identified him, recorded his license plate, and preserved the flyer, the case might never have been solved. And if Russo had gotten away with this crime, he would almost certainly have tried again and again, driven now by the thirst to kill. On Easter Sunday in 2015, the clouds over Wiltshire, England, parted just enough to allow a small plane carrying 12 skydivers to ascend into the sky. For Victoria Cilliers, the jump was nothing new. An experienced professional instructor, Vicky had completed thousands of jumps. Each time she landed safely and returned home to her family. But this jump was unlike any before it, and this Easter, she would not return home. Victoria's case is truly unique. There was a catastrophic lack of evidence against the prime suspect. The crime theory seemed far-fetched. The suspect led a double life. The victim refused to seek justice, and the testimony was so illogical that understanding what had happened proved an overwhelming challenge for the jury, who were reportedly overwhelmed by stress. Victoria was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. She attended the University of Glasgow and, after qualifying as a physiotherapist, joined the British Army. By 2015, she had already risen to the rank of captain. Thanks to her career, she met Sergeant Emile Cilliers in 2010. Emile had suffered a skiing injury, and Vicky helped him recover. Emile grew up in a small town near Johannesburg, South Africa. He moved to the United Kingdom several years earlier and also served in the Royal Army's Physical Training Corps. The attraction between Vicky and Emile was instant. Both were athletic, active, and adrenaline enthusiasts. They married in 2011 in a magical ceremony in Cape Town, and then settled in Wiltshire, in a home Vicky had purchased using her family inheritance. The couple went on to have 2 children, April, followed by Ben 3 years later. Vicky was a frequent visitor to the Wiltshire Parachute Center, a base for the Army Parachute Association. She had completed her first jump at 16 and immediately fell in love with the sport. Now, at 39, she was a professional skydiving instructor. By the spring of 2015, she had performed over 2,600 jumps. Of course, during her pregnancies, Vicky couldn't indulge in her passion, but now, with her youngest child just 5 weeks old, she was eager to get back in the game, so to speak. Her excitement was unmatched when one day her husband came home with a broad smile and announced he had booked them a tandem skydive. It was a chance to break free from the monotony of daily life, and Vicky was overjoyed with anticipation. However, on Easter Sunday, the day of the scheduled jump, Vicky felt unusually anxious. The circumstances leading up to the jump did little to ease her nerves. Initially, she and Emile were supposed to skydive on Saturday, April 4th. But first, Emile couldn't find a babysitter for their children, leaving Vicky to jump alone. Then, severe weather caused the jump to be postponed until the following day. On April 5th, the wind had calmed, and the skies were less overcast. Even so, the divers had to wait in the hangar until 4 p.m. before getting the green light to jump. By then, Vicky was genuinely fatigued and just wanted to return home to her children. Still, this was Emile's gift, and he wanted her to enjoy herself. Vicky didn't want to disappoint him. She dismissed her unease, attributing it to nerves over her first jump after a long break. Besides, she was exceptionally well trained. If anything went wrong, she would be the one to fix it. She was taught to handle various skydiving mishaps. Vicky had even chased down less experienced divers during freefall, taken control, and helped them land safely. Since the weather was still less than ideal, the plan was for the plane to ascend no higher than 1,500 meters. It would be a simple and quick jump. Vicky was the last to leap from the aircraft and immediately felt elated. Everything seemed perfect. This was the adrenaline rush she had missed so much. But when her parachute deployed, she knew right away something was wrong. The lines were tangled. While this wasn't unprecedented, Vicky tried to untangle them. When her efforts failed, she didn't waste time and cut away the main chute to deploy the reserve. The reserve chute, however, didn't fully open. Only a small part of the parachute held her in the air, rendering it practically useless. Vicky began to spin wildly as she plummeted toward the ground. But thoughts of death didn't cross her mind. Her 2 children needed their mother. Desperately, she twisted her body to try and minimize the impact. After 1 or 2 minutes of frantic panic, the deafening rush of wind, and a rapid descent, her vision darkened. Vicky hit the ground. It was unbelievable. Both of Victoria Cilliers' parachutes had failed, and she fell without either one functioning. The staff at the parachute center didn't expect to find Vicky alive and even brought a body bag. But to their amazement, when they found her lying in a field, she was breathing and had regained consciousness. Initially, Vicky didn't even understand why everyone was fussing over her. By a stroke of luck, one of the skydivers was a doctor. He provided first aid and ensured her spine was not injured. Vicky was airlifted to the hospital. She suffered a fractured pelvis, several broken ribs on one side, and a damaged lung. But she survived. Her miraculous survival was attributed to a combination of factors. First, her light body weight. Second, her rapid spinning in the air, which softened the fall. Most importantly, she was incredibly fortunate to land on a freshly plowed field. While it was far from a soft landing, she lost consciousness on impact. The soft soil saved her life. Many associate skydiving with inherent danger. It's undoubtedly an adrenaline-fueled hobby, but accidents involving failures in both the main and reserve parachutes are extraordinarily rare, literally 1 in a million. Even the use of a reserve parachute is infrequent, occurring only once in 750 jumps. Given this, the chief instructor at the Army Parachute Association grew suspicious upon hearing about Vicky's failed jump. He immediately began inspecting her equipment. The instructor confirmed that the lines of the main parachute were tangled, which was why Vicky had cut it away. However, the reserve parachute was missing 2 critical components of its harness. As a result, it had partially deployed, but couldn't support Vicky in the air as it should have. He carefully examined the attachment points where the missing components should have been and found no signs of mechanical failure. Yet he knew that the reserve parachute had never been deployed before and had been inspected 16 times by 10 different experienced staff members at the center. Each inspection confirmed the components were in place. Their sudden and unexplained disappearance could only mean one thing: they had been deliberately removed. The chief instructor called the police, but he wasn't the first. A close friend of Vicky's, shaken by the circumstances of her fall, had already contacted the police, voicing her suspicions about Vicky's husband, Emil. She described their relationship as toxic, armed with the parachute as physical evidence of tampering and the testimony of Vicky's friend pointing to a potential suspect. Wiltshire police launched an official investigation. Meanwhile, Vicky spent several weeks in the hospital before returning home. Though she still wore a supportive brace, she was no longer bedridden. Her husband, Emil, helped her during recovery, and Vicky believed that his support was key to her swift progress. On Tuesday, April 28th, Emil left for work as usual, but he didn't return. He was arrested on suspicion of attempting to murder his wife. He offered no resistance during the arrest, made no claims of innocence, but did express outrage that he was taken into custody in front of his colleagues and subordinates. At the station, Emil played it smart. Fully aware that police would uncover incriminating evidence on his confiscated phone, he preemptively addressed the topics he knew they'd raise. His hope was that the detectives would believe his explanations, and he'd never have to deal with them again. Emil admitted he had been planning to leave Vicky for some time, claiming that she didn't measure up to his expectations in the bedroom. They only had intimacy twice a week. He revealed an affair with Austrian skydiving instructor Stephanie Goller, whom he'd met on Tinder during a skiing trip abroad. Though they had been seeing each other for only 5 months, Emil was already envisioning a future with her. But the revelations didn't stop there. Emil openly suggested a possible motive for killing his wife. He was deeply in debt to payday loan companies. As if that weren't enough to cast suspicion on him, Emil also let slip that on the Saturday before Vicky's planned jump, he had taken her parachute into a restroom. He claimed he did this because their daughter needed the bathroom, and he didn't want to leave the parachute unattended. Since Emil was in custody, he couldn't return home after work. Instead, detectives came to see Vicky and informed her of her husband's arrest. To Vicky, their accusations sounded absurd. She admitted she suspected Emil was having an affair and was aware of his financial irresponsibility. However, despite Emil's flaws, Vicky assured investigators that their marriage was unremarkable, and she didn't believe he harbored any ill will toward her. But was this truly the case? Their relationship had started like a fairy tale. Emil had been gentle and attentive, willing to do anything for Vicky. When their relationship became more serious, it was time for Vicky to meet Emil's children from his first marriage. But first, his ex-wife, Carly, wanted to meet Vicky. The two met at a cafe and had a pleasant conversation until Carly asked a question that left Vicky utterly shocked. "You do know about the other children, don't you?" "What other children?" Vicky asked, stunned. It turned out that Emil had 4 children, but he had only told Vicky about 2 of them. Furious, embarrassed, and humiliated, Vicky returned home and confronted Emil. He explained that he hadn't mentioned the other children because their mother had kept them away from him. But Emil had lied. Emil Cilliers never knew rejection. His father owned a contracting company, and the boy was given everything he wanted. When Emil grew up, he got a job at his father's company. At 17, Emil decided he wanted a relationship. His eye fell on 13-year-old Nicolina. At 16, the girl gave birth to their first child. She had a cesarean section. As the girl later revealed, just 10 days after the birth of their daughter, Emil demanded intimacy with her. He either didn't understand or didn't care that it could be dangerous. It's no surprise that 6 months later, she was already pregnant with their son. At that point, Emil decided to go to the UK for a short while to earn some money for his children. However, instead, he joined the country's military and started dating Carly. His mother had to break the news to Nicolina, who had no idea until that conversation that she had been betrayed. The relationship with Carly progressed quickly, and soon they were married and parents to 2 wonderful children. Meanwhile, Nicolina also moved to the UK with her children. In fact, she wanted Emil to be involved in their lives and reached out to him. The man casually told the girl that he had married Carly only for the visa. Nicolina believed him and forgave him. After that, the man managed to live with 2 families for a long time, and neither woman suspected anything until the truth came out. Carly told Vicky everything and warned her that Emil would treat her the same way. However, Vicky fell for the man's charm and couldn't break up with him at that time, especially since she found out she was pregnant. She and Emil were over the moon with happiness, but a month or 2 later, she had a miscarriage. Vicky was deeply upset and felt unwell, but their day was already fully planned. They were supposed to go to London, where Emil had a cricket game scheduled. Then they planned to walk around the city and stay overnight. Vicky, of course, wanted to cancel everything, but Emil insisted. He didn't want to let the team down or lose money on accommodation. But when they arrived at their destination after a long day, it turned out that it wasn't a hotel, but a shared room for all the team players, where they would sleep in sleeping bags with their partners. Vicky couldn't sleep in those conditions after a miscarriage and asked to go home. They had already attended the game. In response, Emil simply handed her the car keys, and she drove home alone for 2 hours, enduring the fatigue and pain because her husband preferred his cricket team members over her. Fortunately, they soon welcomed their daughter, and shortly after, Vicky found out she was expecting their second child. Her joy was only overshadowed by thoughts of finances. Both of them worked and earned well, but they didn't live extravagantly. Meanwhile, Emil had somehow managed to accumulate debts, which continued to grow. Emil's neglect became more and more apparent with each passing day. Vicky suspected that he might be unfaithful. One day they were out with friends, drinking, and their phones were lying on the table. Suddenly, one of the phones made a sound. It wasn't just any sound, but a notification from a well-known dating site, one you couldn't mistake. Their friends laughed and joked that someone had found a match, but it turned out that the person was Emil. All their friends found out that he was chatting with girls on the dating site while his wife was preparing to become a mother for the second time. Of course, the friends tried to smooth things over with jokes, but Vicky probably wished she could disappear into the ground. The most shocking thing was that from that moment, their relationship started to deteriorate, not because of Vicky, but because of Emil. His wife suddenly bored him. It got to the point where Emil told his wife that he would stay with her for a few months after the birth of their second child, and then he would need to reconsider their marriage. How could a man say such a thing to his pregnant wife? But the final straw for Vicky came when he paid for a dance lesson on Valentine's Day. Needless to say, he didn't invite his wife to the dance. Until then, Vicky had been able to overlook his actions, but this confirmed that he was actively dating other women. She understood that their marriage was over. But then one day he came home with a wide smile and announced that he had a surprise for her, a tandem skydive. On the scheduled day, Saturday, he behaved perfectly, just like before. He held her parachute and watched over the kids. The detectives didn't miss the opportunity to ask the woman if she remembered how Emil had briefly left with her parachute to go to the bathroom. She confirmed that their daughter needed to use the restroom, and he took her. But he was gone for only 2-3 minutes, not nearly long enough to do anything with the parachute. The woman insisted that her husband was incapable of harming her. It was one thing to cheat, but murder was a betrayal of an entirely different magnitude. However, when they asked her if anything else strange had happened around that time, she unknowingly made an incredible statement. Victoria recounted that about a week before her fall, there was a gas leak in their home. She was home with the children while Emil wasn't there, staying at the army barracks to get an early start on work. Upon waking up, Vicky smelled gas and discovered it was coming from the pipe connected to the stove in the kitchen. She noticed blood on the pipe. Emil had recently cut himself, and she had to wipe the blood off all the surfaces in the house. She texted her husband, asking if he had done anything to the pipe since it smelled like gas. He responded, saying it was strange, and asked, "Is the stove working?" Of course, Vicky wasn't planning to light the stove in a kitchen filled with gas. She decided her husband had asked the question without thinking and jokingly replied, "Are you trying to kill me?" A truly innocent person would have laughed it off and apologized for the hasty question, but Emil started making excuses. Forensic experts who inspected the stove confirmed that someone had loosened the bolt on the pipe. Moreover, the marks and scratches on the pipe indicated that this person didn't know what they were doing. Investigators felt it was crucial that the supposed victim of these crimes was on their side, so they decided to show her just how unfaithful her husband had been. They hoped this would help her see his behavior in a new light. First, they mentioned his romantic entanglements. The detectives informed Vicky that her husband had been seeing a mistress. He and Stephanie had exchanged over 32,000 messages. Emil had lied to Stephanie, claiming he would leave Vicky as soon as their second child was born. He said this was because only then could he get a DNA test that would prove the child wasn't his. In other words, he invented a story about an affair Vicky supposedly had. He also made a very compromising promise. "From April, I'll be able to manage my time more flexibly. I'll do anything for you." He sent this message in January, meaning, according to the police, he had been planning to get rid of Vicky since then. And if his plan with the gas stove had worked, he likely would have gotten rid of his children too. But that wasn't all. He regularly used the services of sex workers and visited a swingers club, where he was even kicked out. What kind of person gets kicked out of a place where people are generally tolerant and understanding? However, the most devastating blow for Vicky was the news that her husband had also been seeing his ex-wife, Carly. 10 years after their divorce, they had rekindled their relationship behind Vicky's back. The women had been communicating and coordinating when Emil would spend time with the children. They almost had a friendship, or so Vicky thought. But even that wasn't everything. Emil owed not just a few £1,000s, as Vicky had thought, but more than 20,000. At first, he had managed to come up with reasonable explanations for asking his wife for money. But when she gave him access to her account, he freely spent the funds as he pleased. And his spending was large and often extravagant, such as purchasing a new aquarium, paying for dance lessons for two on Valentine's Day, which he didn't invite Vicky to, or a romantic all-inclusive weekend with Stephanie. Of course, Vicky wasn't a fool or blind, even though she had been blinded by love. She noticed her husband flirting with other women and his excessive spending, but he always had an explanation ready, often ridiculous. He claimed that someone had cloned his phone number to send messages to pretty, sometimes very young girls, and hackers had stolen money from his account. When the police opened Victoria's eyes to the full truth, she felt deceived, humiliated, but above all, she was disturbed by her husband's lies about their son. If he could lie about that, he could fabricate anything. Why lie about the child not being his and claiming he would do a DNA test to prove it? Victoria couldn't forgive that. She provided the detectives with crucial evidence that became a key piece in the case against her husband. She revealed that Emil had spent not 3 minutes, but 10 minutes in the bathroom with her parachute. Moreover, after the parachute jump was canceled that Saturday, Victoria planned to take the parachute to the drop zone, but her husband suggested she just leave it in her locker for the night, as she would return the next day. She listened to him. Investigators had already wondered why Emil would take the bulky parachute into the cramped bathroom with his daughter. But if Emil had gone in with the parachute, was it possible for him to take it out, tangle the cords, remove the 2 fastenings from the reserve chute, and repack it? They conducted an experiment, and it showed that 5 minutes was indeed enough to sabotage the parachute. At the end of 2017, Emil was charged with 2 attempted murders. The case against him largely consisted of circumstantial evidence. For instance, investigators discovered that a few days before Victoria's parachute incident, Emil had searched online for a wet nurse, as if he knew his wife wouldn't be able to breastfeed their 5-week-old son. However, there was no direct evidence linking him to the sabotage parachute or the gas pipe. Emil also took the witness stand. Trying to explain the gas leak, he claimed that there was construction work down the street from their house, and the vibrations caused the bolt to loosen by itself. He also suggested that the jury should consider the possibility that Victoria had sabotaged her own parachute because she wanted to die. To the prosecutor's horror, the testimony of the would-be victim cast doubt on Emil's guilt. Victoria admitted that when she was pregnant for the second time, suspecting her husband of infidelity and excessive spending, she had threatened to kill herself unless he straightened out and became a better husband. Victoria also said she had thought a lot about the incident and came to the conclusion that she had cut the main parachute, even though experts had confirmed that the cords had been tangled and that she had followed the instructions. Victoria further explained that she had exaggerated the time when she gave her second testimony to the police, and that Emil hadn't been in the bathroom for as long as she had initially stated. She claimed that she wanted to get back at him for the offense he had caused her. Emil's defense lawyers, in turn, argued that Victoria was more valuable to Emil alive than dead. Victoria confirmed this. She had removed her husband from the inheritance of her estate and house. She told them she had changed her will to ensure her children would be protected if anything happened to her, as she did not trust her husband financially. However, after his wife's death, Emil would have been entitled to a £120,000 insurance payout. This amount would allow him to pay off his debts and still have some left over. The jury had a hard time. They deliberated for 8 days and couldn't come to a unanimous decision. They were dismissed when 2 jurors became ill due to stress. It is unclear what exactly happened during their deliberations, but it can be assumed that it was very tense. The prosecution tried again to convict Emil in the spring of 2018. The new jury members were shown the messages Emil had sent to his mistress and ex-wife. Some were sent while he was in the hospital, sitting at the bedside of his wife, who had nearly died. Others were sent when she gave birth to his son just a few weeks before the incident. This time, the jury found him guilty on all charges. In the end, Emil Cilliers was undone by the lies he had crafted over all those years. Once those lies were revealed at once, he could no longer squirm, lie, or hide the truth. Unfortunately, Emil's influence on Vicky was too great, and after the trial, she stated that she had not come to terms with the verdict and did not plan to divorce her husband. 6 to 8 weeks after the trial, she regularly visited him and called him every day. Emil assured her that she was everything he had. This was probably the first time he told the truth. During the trial, not a single friend, family member, or colleague came to support him. But later, Vicky admitted that she had gone to visit her husband with a large notebook in which she had written down all the questions she wanted answers to. Of course, Emil did not confess to anything. Power over his wife meant everything to him, and his power lay in the answers he could give her. This was the only remaining way for him to manipulate Vicky. Investigators later said that this was a case where justice was done for the victim who did not want it. If the lead instructor of the base hadn't examined the parachute, and if her friend hadn't called to say that things weren't going well in her family, one of Emil's attempts to kill his wife could have ended in success. This is a unique story of a woman whose husband never stopped trying and failing to kill her. She survived 2 attempts on her life. Unfortunately, sometimes victims cannot set healthy boundaries for themselves. If a husband tries to kill his wife twice and that's not enough to kill the romance, it's toxic love. It's like a skydiver with a faulty parachute. It promises an exhilarating jump, but inevitably leads to a fatal fall. It took a long time before Vicky recognized her husband's control over her, but she did. She demanded a divorce. Emil refused to grant it for a long time, claiming that their marriage still had a future, but she got what she wanted. In 2019, Vicky published a book titled, "I Survived. I Married a Wonderful Man, Then He Tried to Kill Me." As the final step to turn the page on this chapter of her life, Vicky jumped with a parachute for charity and donated the funds raised to the air ambulance and medical staff who saved her life. She did the tandem jump with a friend to feel the support of a reliable shoulder and friendly companionship. And on the field, her children were waiting for her. Today, Vicky still finds it difficult to fully trust another person, but she is happy. She is raising her children, and she even found love. Her chosen one was among the other skydivers who jumped with her that fateful day. It's wonderful that she was able to see the happiness that was always so close to her. In most American cities, there is a neighborhood where the houses are bigger and more beautiful. The lawns are perfectly trimmed, the grass is greener, and people enjoy an ideal life surrounded by upper-class families who have inherited generational wealth. In Detroit, that neighborhood is Grosse Pointe Park, the most desirable suburb with the best schools, churches, and parks. A perfect, picturesque place, like something out of the Truman Show, where nothing ever seems to happen. This was the neighborhood that Jane and Bob Bashara made their home, where they raised their 2 children. Bob and Jane had been together for almost 30 years. In Grosse Pointe Park, the couple was not only well-known, but also well-loved. 54-year-old Robert, or Big Bob, as everyone called him, was the son of a judge. As a teenager, he bought his first property and never regretted it. Over the years, he built a successful business renting out both residential and commercial properties. 56-year-old Jane was a marketing director. She had taken a break from work for a while but returned when the economic crisis affected her husband's business. In addition to their careers, The couple was deeply involved in volunteer work. They had 2 children, a son, Robert Bashara Jr., and a daughter, Jessica. Their lives were much like those of their neighbors, but that all changed on January 24, 2012. That evening, Bob and Jane spoke on the phone while she was driving home from work and he was tidying up around one of his rental properties. Jane said she was on her way home and would be there in 20 minutes. Her voice sounded normal. But when Bob arrived home around 8 p.m., he was surprised to find that his wife wasn't there yet. At first, he assumed she had been delayed by something, but as the hours passed, that explanation no longer made sense, especially since she wasn't answering her phone. Bob called the police. He wasn't in a panic, but he was concerned and asked for help. He also contacted their children and friends. Unfortunately, none of them had any idea where Jane could be. At 9:30 a.m., officers knocked on the door. They informed Bob that his wife had been murdered. He recalls falling to his knees. It was the worst news he could have ever received. They didn't explain how she had been killed and asked him to wait for the medical examiner's report. After that, Bob had to break the devastating news to his children himself that their mother was gone. A few hours earlier, tow truck drivers had started their shift in Detroit's east side. One of them noticed a black Mercedes SUV parked in an alley. It was important to note that this was a rough neighborhood. Abandoned houses, filth, trash littering the streets, and of course, rampant crime, especially drug trafficking. A luxury car like that wouldn't have stood out in Grosse Pointe Park, but here, it was impossible to miss. The vehicle was covered in dust and dirt, but on the driver's side, some of it had been partially wiped away, as if someone had leaned against it. Inside, Jane's belongings were scattered. Her purse's contents, a bottle of her prescribed medication, and on the back seat lay Jane herself. Her lifeless body, with bruises on the left side of her face and neck, told detectives a grim story. She had been brutally beaten before she died. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with those closest to the victim, starting with Bob Bashara. Bob was eager to help the police and answered all their questions. He allowed officers to search the house to ensure everything was in order. He told them that on the evening of January 24th, he and his wife had planned to work on their taxes. They spoke on the phone and he told Jane he would be home around 8 p.m. Bob said he had spent most of the afternoon and early evening cleaning up around one of the properties he owned. However, before heading home, he ran into a friend and had a drink with him at the Hard Luck Lounge Bar. The friends parted ways around 8 p.m. After some hesitation, Bob decided to share something else. He admitted that his wife occasionally used illegal substances, specifically marijuana. Jane would smoke it before bed to help her sleep better, and Bob didn't see a problem with it. He wasn't sure where she bought it, but he speculated that it might have been in the eastern part of Detroit. Bob could have been right, but before detectives could consider that angle, they needed to determine where Jane had actually been abducted and murdered. Examining the evidence, detectives found that the pieces didn't quite fit together. There were no signs of a struggle inside the SUV. While Jane's purse was on the floor, all her valuables remained untouched. A random thief would have taken them, which ruled out a robbery gone wrong. It also didn't seem like she had simply ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The most logical conclusion was clear: Jane had been brought there. 2 days after the murder, the medical examiner confirmed what investigators already suspected. The victim had died a painful death. She had been strangled, most likely with bare hands. However, she did not go down without a fight. One of her nails had broken during the struggle with her attacker. This meant there was hope of finding the killer's DNA. Bob suggested that what happened to his wife might be connected to a series of unsolved murders. At the time, there had been a string of killings with a common pattern. Women who had arranged to meet someone they met on an adult website vanished, only for their bodies to later be discovered in the trunks of cars. Could Jane, found in the backseat of her SUV, have been the fifth victim? The police didn't think so. They had an entirely different theory. Investigators were working with the theory that Jane's body had been transported to the dirty alleyway, but that she had been killed 11 kilometers away, in the beautiful and affluent Grosse Pointe Park. That meant their top priority was verifying her husband's alibi. Detectives spoke with Mike, the owner of the Hard Luck Lounge Bar. The bar was located in a building owned by Bob. Mike's staff had seen Bob outside and inside the bar. Later, as Bob had stated, his friend joined him. His story checked out. Well, almost. Mike was surprised to hear that Bob had supposedly been cleaning up outside one of his rental properties. Bob never did that kind of work himself. He always hired someone for it. Still, multiple people had seen Bob, and his alibi seemed solid. But this is where one of the case's many unbelievable twists begins. Since there hadn't been a murder in Grosse Pointe Park for 20 years, the media paid a lot of attention to Jane's death. Bob was shown repeatedly in the news, which led to an unexpected result. People who knew Bob started reaching out to the police, not as the respectable resident of an upscale neighborhood or a landlord, but as Master Bob. Bob had a hidden side, a secret penchant for unconventional, intimate experiences. He had equipped a secret room for entertainment in the basement of the same building as the Hard Luck Lounge, where men and women would come dressed head to toe in leather, wearing masks and carrying whips. In addition to a bed, the room featured chains hanging from the ceiling, whips and devices for a more unconventional experience. In particular, a woman named Lynn contacted the police. She had met Bob on an adult website, and he had told her about his secret room beneath the bar. Lynn had never been to such places before, but she agreed to his invitation. They met at the bar with another woman, chatted for a while, and had some drinks. Then they went down to the basement and spent time there enjoying themselves. However, Lynn never returned after that night. The reason was that she had become more interested in the other woman, while Bob was excessively self-absorbed and too dominant over the women. Bob's new side of life was important to the police, as it provided insight into his character. However, investigators were more concerned with the fact that he had a long-term mistress, which had a destructive impact on his relationship with Jane. The woman who had been in the basement with Lynn and Bob, seemingly preferring submission in intimate games, was actually not as submissive as she appeared, because it was she who began to dominate Bob's life. Her name was Rachel Gillette, a 50-year-old divorced single mother. She worked as a secretary at Wayne State University. The lovers met on an adult website, but their connection was not limited to unusual pleasures. They had been seeing each other for over 3 years. Bob even attended Rachel's daughter's wedding in South Carolina in 2011. It seemed as if they were obsessed with each other. Rachel dreamed of making Bob a permanent part of her life, but when she saw him on TV mourning his murdered wife, she felt betrayed. She was shocked to realize that the divorce, which she had believed took place in May, was a lie. Now she found herself at the center of a scandalous case in a public investigation. This was the situation just a few days after the murder when, unexpectedly, Bob suggested to the police that they look into another potential suspect, Joe Gents. Bob Bashara and Joe Gents had met in September 2011. The men were introduced by Steve Thibodeau, the owner of a furniture and home equipment store. Bob had been buying supplies for his properties from Steve for years. Joe had once worked for Steve, and Steve had asked Bob a favor, to help Joe find housing. Bob agreed and even helped Joe make some extra money. Joe did some work at Bob's home and at his rental properties. Joe was a large 48-year-old man with the mental capacity of a child. During an interview at the station, he denied involvement in the crime. But while he didn't say much to the detectives, his behavior screamed that he was hiding something. Detectives wanted to clarify with Bob why he suspected his employee in the first place. However, before they could do that, Joe Gents returned to the precinct to confess to the crime. His interrogation, which lasted for 2 days with breaks, revealed that despite Joe coming forward on his own, he kept changing and contradicting his statements. He would burst into angry outbursts, denying everything, and then, in a barely audible whisper, admit to the crime. At first, Joe claimed that he had done everything himself. Then he said that he acted under Bob's pressure. Here's what he essentially said. On that fateful evening, Joe arrived at the Bashara house around 7 p.m. under the pretense of moving some boxes. Bob let him into the garage. When Jane arrived, she started arguing with her husband. Bob then turned to Joe and said, "Deal with this." Joe hesitated, so Bob pulled out a gun and pointed it at him, making sure Jane couldn't see it. After a moment of hesitation, Joe struck Jane from behind on the neck to knock her to the floor. He then strangled her with his hands while Bob continued to yell at him. To finish the job, Joe pressed his booted foot onto Jane's neck. He was certain she was dead because he heard a cracking sound. Once it was over, Bob walked over to his dead wife and said, "Sorry, baby, I didn't mean to." The men then placed Jane's body into her SUV and Joe drove it to the eastern part of Detroit, where he dumped her in the alley where she was later found. What did Joe receive for this? It seemed like a simple question, but even with this, Joe kept changing his story. First, he said it was $2,000, then $3,000, then $4,000. Eventually, he settled on saying Bob had given him $8,000 in a used Cadillac. The detectives were unsure whether they could trust the chaotic account of someone with obvious intellectual disabilities. At the same time, they couldn't keep him in the precinct without charges. So they released Joe to go home and began verifying his story. First, they examined the phone records of both Bob and Joe. From September until January 27th, they had called each other 472 times. The day before Jane's murder, they spoke 22 times. Was there an innocent reason for these calls? Bob claimed that Joe had been asking him for money due to personal family problems, as he was going through a custody battle and needed money for a lawyer. On the other hand, Joe claimed that Bob had been calling him because, in the days leading up to his wife's death, he was in despair. He kept repeating that his time was running out and that his wife couldn't be in his way. He even mentioned that he had a deadline. Detectives guessed what that deadline might have been. Bob's mistress, Rachel Gillette, had grown tired of his lies over the 3 years they'd been seeing each other. Bob had claimed to be a widower, then a divorcee, and even promised he'd get divorced. Over the weekend before the murder, she had given him an ultimatum, demanding to see his divorce papers. Next, Joe stated that the struggle with Jane had occurred by the car on the driver's side, exactly where the dust had been smudged. He also described the items left inside the vehicle after the murder. The items he mentioned exactly matched what officers had found. After disposing of the body, Joe went to the nearest McDonald's to grab a bite to eat. The surveillance camera confirmed this as well. Finally, officers found Joe's shoes, which he had tried to dispose of by placing them in a donation bin. DNA from Jane was found on the soles, but the shoes weren't the only source of DNA evidence. Joe claimed that Jane had fought for her life and showed the detectives scratches on his chest and back to prove it. Therefore, it was only natural that on the broken nail of the victim, forensic experts found Joe Jentz's DNA. The detectives spent almost a month verifying his statements before they finally arrested him and charged him with murder. Bob Bashara's explanation seemed logical at first, as he insisted that he had no involvement in his wife's murder. He argued that his only mistake was trying to help Joe and giving him work. Joe, who had been dealing with a custody battle and needed money for a lawyer, was reportedly angry that Bob refused to simply give him the money. Bob suggested that this anger led Joe to kill Jane in an attempt to frame his employer. Bob's argument made sense on the surface. After all, if he had wanted to hire someone to commit such a crime, he wouldn't have chosen a person with an IQ of only 68, nor would he have done it in his own garage, in his own home. It seemed like a far-fetched scenario, but then Bob did something that no one expected. Steve Thibodeau, Bob's friend and the owner of a furniture store, came forward to the police after Joe Jentz's arrest. He revealed that a few weeks later, Bob asked him to come over to his house to look at a broken refrigerator. However, when Steve arrived, Bob began talking about how something needed to be done about Joe. Realizing the potential significance of this conversation, the police decided to equip Steve with a recording device and send him back to meet Bob, hoping that he would say something incriminating. The next time Bob drove to Steve's store, FBI agents were already following him. Bob seemed nervous, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He immediately asked Steve if he was wearing a microphone. Bob even searched Steve but did not find the hidden device. Surprisingly, the first thing Bob said to Steve was that he hadn't killed his wife. He explained that he had no reason to do so, pointing out that Jane earned $125,000 a year and was much more valuable alive. Therefore, he suggested that Joe Jentz must have acted alone or possibly with someone else's help. Then Bob finally got to the point. He promised Steve $20,000 if he could find a killer in prison who could take care of Joe. 3 days later, Bob returned to Steve's store with $2,000 in cash. He seemed to distrust Steve, speaking in hushed tones, but this didn't stop the police from recording everything, including Bob's request for a check, not for the killing, but supposedly for some goods. Moments later, after the meeting, Bob was arrested. He was charged with attempted murder. Faced with the evidence, including the recordings, Bob decided not to fight the charges. In court, he tearfully confessed to his plans to hire a hitman and apologized to Joe. However, he never fully explained why he wanted Joe dead. His apology seemed strange to many. It would have made sense if Bob wanted to get revenge for his wife's murder, but his actions contradicted that logic. If he had truly hated Joe, he would not have apologized. Instead, Bob was sentenced to nearly 7 years in prison for his involvement in the plot to kill Joe. Then, just 10 days later, Joe confessed to the murder. He was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for testifying against Bob. The trial against Bob began in October 2014. Looking at the defendant, it was hard to believe the charges brought against him. He was very polite, delicate, and appeared genuinely innocent. Since there was no physical evidence linking him to his wife's murder, the prosecutor decided to focus on the defendant's lifestyle. They called many people to testify about intimate encounters with Master Bob. Additionally, several pieces of circumstantial evidence were presented. For example, the ping from Bob's phone contradicted his alibi. According to the phone data, at the time of his wife's murder, he could have been at home. The officer who informed Bob of his wife's death testified that he did not react as dramatically as he claimed. However, the most incriminating evidence came from Bob's mother. Bob had always insisted that he didn't own a gun and couldn't have threatened Joe Gents with one. But his mother revealed that 5 months after Jane's death, she found a weapon in his safe deposit box. She reported the discovery to Bob's lawyer, who kept it quiet for 14 months before handing it over to the police. Although everyone thought Rachel was the other woman in Bob's life, the jurors heard that Bob had plans for another lover. He and Rachel wanted to live with another woman in a threesome. Several months before Jane's death, Bob and Rachel had been looking for a love nest. They particularly liked one house. If they wanted to move into that house, the final date for the deal was January 27th, just 3 days after Jane's murder. This was another deadline, after which Bob could say goodbye to the house they had their eye on. Moreover, he had already found a woman who could live with them in the house, Janet Lehman. Bob met her online and tried to convince her to move in with him and Rachel in Grosse Pointe Park. Janet replied that she didn't want to be the third person in a relationship, but Bob persisted. 2 weeks before his wife's death, he even traveled to Oregon to spend the weekend with Janet. Since the prosecutor focused on the defendant's intimate preferences and barely spoke about the facts of the case, Bob's attorney decided to prove that Jane had been aware of her husband's unusual inclinations and that this could not have been a motive for murder. The attorney called Jane's friend to the stand. The friend testified that once Bob invited Jane to a special party. It was supposed to involve all the guests throwing their car keys into a communal bowl, from which they would draw keys at random and then retire with the person whose key they pulled. Jane told her husband she would not attend such a party, but she allowed him to do as he wished. Bob's attorney argued in court that the defendant had not become this person overnight. He had been like this for years. Moreover, he had been married before and had divorced his first wife, meaning he knew how to part with someone without killing them. Additionally, the attorney pointed out several key mistakes made by the police. Since Grosse Pointe Park hadn't seen a murder in a long time, the detectives and forensic experts were inexperienced in investigating such crimes. They failed to check the victim's belongings for foreign fibers, did not gather surveillance footage from the bar to fully confirm or deny the defendant's alibi, and made errors during witness interviews. Finally, it was expected that Joe Gents would be the star witness for the prosecution. However, in court, he shocked everyone by refusing to testify. Bob's attorney was ready to tear him apart during cross-examination, but both she and the prosecutor had to accept that the man never took the witness stand. Now, Bob's fate rested in the hands of the jury. After nearly 3 days of deliberations, they reached a decision to convict the defendant on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. And then another incredible twist occurred in the case. In December 2015, a year after Bob had been sentenced, the judge received a letter from Joe Gents. This was not just any letter, but a written confession which had been dictated by his cellmate. In it, Joe explained that on that fateful January evening, he had gone to Bob's house alone, angry because Bob hadn't paid him for some work. He knew that Bob wasn't home. He entered the house, went into the garage where he was noticed by Jane, and he lost control. He killed her. Joe wrote that he could no longer live with the burden of knowing that Bob Bashara was completely innocent. By that time, Bob had filed an appeal, and this confession from Joe could change everything. The judge decided to hold a special hearing on this matter. However, when Joe entered the courtroom, before he could say anything, the judge explained to him that he had agreed to a deal with the prosecution, which required him to tell the truth, but he had lied, and now he was facing problems. Joe nodded, walked up to the witness stand, and holding his written confession in his hand, said that it was trash, that he had made it up, thinking he would serve a shorter sentence. He then began to testify, saying that Bob was with him in the garage during the murder of his wife. The judge denied Bob the request for a new trial. He lost his appeal and continued to serve his sentence in prison. Both Bob and Joe gave numerous interviews to the media after that. Joe continued to make highly contradictory statements. For example, during a phone conversation with a journalist, he claimed that 4 people had been in the garage during Jane's murder. But when the journalist asked him to explain what he meant and who else was in the garage, Joe pretended that it was very noisy in prison and that he couldn't hear her well. As for Bob Bashara, he always insisted on his innocence and claimed he would maintain that until his last breath. In this, he did not lie. In August 2020, Bob was hospitalized. By that time, he had lost a lot of weight and was suffering from diabetes. He passed away in the hospital at the age of 62. At the end of 2016, the building that housed the Hard Luck Lounge Bar in Bob's secret room burned down. and Joe Gents may be released as early as March 2nd, 2029. Two sisters on vacation to a paradise-like Hawaiian island. At least that's what other tourists might think, but they'd be wrong. This journey was closer to hell than heaven. The sisters arrived at the luxurious resort with one purpose: to uncover the mystery of what happened to their mother. They were prepared to search for answers alone, but received help from an unexpected source, beyond the grave. Their mother had hidden a clue for them in an envelope with the mundane label, "Childhood Photos." Even when the odds seem stacked against them, the sisters won't stop until they achieve justice. A promise-turned-obsession keeps them steadfast on their path. At the center of this story is Shirlene Van Gundy. Once crowned a beauty queen in her native Colorado, Shirlene was a truly stunning, charming, and fascinating woman, and an unconventional mother. Her daughters, Tammy and Tiffany, adored her. Shirlene acted more like their friend than a strict parent. As Tammy recalls, Shirlene often struggled to take care of herself, let alone anyone else. This may be why Tammy had to take on increasing responsibility for her younger sister and grow up faster than most. Shirlene was also, to put it mildly, emotionally unstable. Her mood swings were sudden and dramatic, and any discussion about them was strictly off limits. Breaking this unspoken rule inevitably led to arguments, as Shirlene refused to acknowledge she had any issues. After Shirlene separated from the girl's father, Tammy made the difficult decision not to go with her. Though she loved her mother deeply, she couldn't bring herself to leave her father behind. For years, the sisters lived apart until their father eventually gained custody of Tiffany as well. From then on, the girls loved and worried about their mother, but always from a distance. Then in the late 1980s, Shirlene told her daughters that she had finally found true happiness after meeting a man named Ken Wakisaka. He accepted and loved her just as she was, with all her quirks and mood swings. The two got married. Because Shirlene had always dreamed of living in Hawaii, Ken accepted a job offer on the islands and moved her to a spacious apartment in a great neighborhood. Of course, Shirlene's daughters met Ken, a chivalrous man who carried himself like a true gentleman. He made a good impression right away, and their mother seemed genuinely happy by his side. 10 years passed, the sisters grew up and started families of their own. Tammy settled in California while Tiffany moved to Arizona. That was how things stood at the beginning of 1998. However, Tammy and Tiffany began to realize that not everything was as smooth as it seemed when Shirlene admitted that she and Ken had been fighting. In mid-1999, the sisters managed to visit their mother to see for themselves what was happening. During that trip, Shirlene made an unusual request. She asked her daughters to promise that if anything ever happened to her, they would investigate what had occurred. Naturally, Tiffany and Tammy were surprised and asked, "Mom, what are you talking about? What do you mean if something happens?" Shirlene didn't elaborate but insisted they give her their word. Not long after that, Shirlene split from Ken. The sisters assumed it was a permanent separation and felt relieved. They were happy to see their mother spending time with them and her grandchildren. But then she vanished. For a week, they didn't hear anything from her until she finally reached out, saying she was back in Hawaii, back with Ken, and that everything was fine. She asked them not to worry. But the sisters had every reason to be concerned. Their mother's behavior became increasingly strange. Shirlene would call Tammy, talk about various things, and then call back an hour later, not remembering anything they had just discussed. This deeply upset Tammy, leaving her unsure of what to think. It got to the point where she often ignored her mother's calls. Naturally, she had no idea what was about to happen. On April 4th, 2000, Shirlene tried calling Tammy once again, but Tammy didn't answer the calls. Instead, Shirlene left several voicemail messages. There was nothing unusual about them. She told Tammy that she loved her, that she had found God, and that everything was fine. Tammy decided to wait until morning to call her mother back. When she finally did, it was Ken who picked up the phone. His words were blunt. "I don't know what's wrong with your mother. Talk to her." Tammy asked Shirlene what was happening, but her mother only replied, "I love you." Her words, however, were slurred and muffled, something Shirlene had never done before. Panicking, Tammy called her sister Tiffany and then immediately contacted Honolulu's emergency services, pleading with them to send an ambulance to her mother's house. At the same time, Tiffany managed to get through to Shirlene and was speaking with her on the phone when she heard the sound of an ambulance siren in the background. Tiffany felt a wave of relief, confident that her older sister, as usual, had everything under control. She was sure the paramedics would save their mother. However, the paramedics couldn't determine who needed help. In their report, they later noted that the 52-year-old patient was conscious and appeared calm. Though her emotional and mental state raised concerns, she seemed unaware of the paramedics' presence. Her husband, Ken, told the medics that his wife had said to him, "I'm dying." He speculated that she might have taken sleeping pills along with a couple of bottles of beer. But the medics didn't find any empty bottles nearby, and there was no smell of alcohol on Shirlene herself. Based on their assessment, they concluded she wasn't under the influence of alcohol or any substances. As a result, the paramedics decided not to take Shirlene to the hospital and left her at home with her husband. Shirlene managed to speak to her younger daughter one more time, but every word she said was labored and difficult. Later that same day, at 2 p.m., Ken called the paramedics again. This time, they transported Shirlene to the hospital and admitted her to the intensive care unit. The doctors did everything they could, but their efforts were in vain. Ken informed Tammy that Shirlene was in a coma, barely clinging to life. Tammy immediately called Tiffany, and the sisters each rushed to the airport in their respective cities, heading straight to Hawaii. They didn't yet realize that the 6-hour flight would only be the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward justice, and how difficult it would be to fulfill the promise they'd made to their mother. At that moment, Tiffany and Tammy only knew one thing. Their mother was on life support, but they didn't yet understand why or what had happened to her. However, even this was enough for the sisters to call the Honolulu Police Department with their suspicions before they even boarded the plane. Naturally, all their concerns revolved around Ken. After landing, Tiffany called the hospital to check on their mother's condition. A hospital staff member informed her that there was no change in Shirlene's state and that Ken had gone home to feed the dogs. Tiffany couldn't believe it. She felt Ken had no right to leave Shirlene alone. When Detective Wayne Cambra, assigned to investigate the case, arrived at the hospital, he also found Ken's behavior suspicious. He wondered if Ken had gone home to clean up a crime scene. Doctors informed the detective that Shirlene had ingested a large dose of pills, and since treatment wasn't administered in time, she had fallen into a coma. Out of caution, Detective Cambra checked whether Ken had any prior run-ins with the law. It turned out that he had been arrested before, for assault. During the flight, Tiffany and Tammy had plenty of time to reflect on what Shirlene had told them 9 months earlier, when they promised to uncover the truth if anything ever happened to her. They didn't yet know what to look for, but they were certain they would find evidence in Ken and Shirlene's apartment. When they arrived, they told Ken they were exhausted from the long journey and asked if they could rest at his apartment. Of course, he handed over the keys and stayed by his wife's side at the hospital. He also gave them a sealed envelope, which they set aside on the back seat of their car for the time being. They were in a rush. The sisters searched the apartment and the surrounding property thoroughly. The doctors believed Shirlene's condition was due to a drug overdose, but Tiffany and Tammy were convinced that their mother hadn't taken the pills willingly. Determined to find evidence, they combed through the house and the yard. It was in the backyard, under a bush, that they discovered packaging from a medication. In their minds, there was only one person who could have hidden it there, Ken Wakisaka. As Tammy and Tiffany were about to get into the car, they remembered another piece of advice their mother had given them. Shirlene had told Tiffany that if anything happened to her, the sisters should ask Ken to give them their childhood photos. Then it hit them, that sealed envelope Ken had handed over. It was labeled childhood pictures, but what they found inside was something entirely different. The envelope contained notes written by Ken. It appeared to be an assignment from an anger management class, a kind of journal listing all the ways he had mistreated Shirlene. "I spat on Shirlene. I yelled at Shirlene. I pushed Shirlene," the notes read, all written in Ken's handwriting. This was the evidence Shirlene had left behind for her daughters. Suddenly, they realized that their mother had been leaving them clues, practically screaming from beyond the grave that she had been the victim of a crime. With the detectives' support, they developed a plan to secretly record a phone conversation with Ken. Tammy called him from the police station, acting friendly and attempting to get him to open up. Ken confessed to Tammy that he was very worried about Shirlene, expressing how much he loved her and how lonely he felt without her. He and Tammy discussed the day in detail. Shirlene had told him she had taken the pills, and she had acted as if she were already saying goodbye to life, but nothing seemed to work. She kept repeating, "The pills aren't working, the pills aren't working." Then hesitating, Ken admitted that Shirlene had asked him to strangle her, but of course, he hadn't done it. Tammy asked if he had considered calling emergency services, but he thought she was just depressed and didn't know what to think. During the conversation, Ken also directly told Tammy that the sisters' behavior seemed suspicious to him. He thought they might try to accuse him of either involuntary manslaughter or murder. He repeatedly assured her that he hadn't harmed his wife, that he hadn't strangled her, and that doctors could check for signs of strangulation. Tammy and Tiffany believed they needed to act quickly. They felt that as long as their mother was alive, they had the right to search Ken and Charlene's house and garage in California. However, when they left the island, Ken allowed the doctors to disconnect Charlene from life support, and she passed away. Detective Wayne Cambra attended the funeral, and in his opinion, Ken's eulogy sounded more like a rehearsed defense speech for a trial. While it's true that not everyone is good at delivering speeches, the various details added up and further convinced the sisters that they had to fulfill their promise to their mother. They were determined to make sure Ken would be held accountable and sent to prison for her murder. The prosecutor took over the case and immediately became intrigued by Ken's mention of strangulation, especially since he had brought it up twice. Ken had mentioned this to the coroner as well, allegedly trying to convince him not to perform an autopsy, insisting that his wife had died of natural causes. However, the autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist concluded that Charlene had died from brain damage caused by strangulation. Up until that point, Charlene's death had been considered a drug overdose by everyone involved: the police, the hospital staff, and even her daughters, Tiffany and Tammy. Ken was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. In 2002, 2 years after Charlene's death, her husband stood trial. The prosecution presented a series of key pieces of evidence. First and foremost, the coroner's conclusion about the cause of her death. Additionally, there was the secretly recorded conversation between Tammy and Ken, his recorded admissions of domestic violence, and the testimony of the sisters. The prosecution also revealed that during his separation from Charlene, Ken had taken out a $150,000 life insurance policy on her, which, according to the prosecution, he later used to convince her to reconcile and return to him. Ken's defense attorney tried to argue that the police had rushed to conclusions and that this was not a murder. The defense even brought forward a coroner who admitted that Charlene could have died from a heart attack rather than brain damage caused by strangulation. Ken never took the witness stand. Finally, after 2 weeks of court proceedings, Tiffany and Tammy heard the verdict. They were overjoyed when 46-year-old Ken was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. This could have been the end of the story, but an astonishing encounter, an interesting coincidence, would change everything. Attorney John Edmonds visited his client, the convicted murderer, in prison. The inmate told the lawyer that Ken didn't belong there and that there were many oddities and inconsistencies in his case. He asked Edmonds to meet with Ken. Edmonds wasn't used to seeking clients in prison, but he was intrigued by the man's words. He reviewed the trial materials and discovered a critical mistake made by the prosecutor. In his closing remarks, the prosecutor had directly accused the defendant of failing to take the witness stand. The prosecutor stated, "If the defendant does not tell us what happened that day, then all we can do is judge by what the body of Charlene tells us." This was a gross error. The Fifth Amendment privilege is the right not to testify against oneself. It's a constitutional right, and the prosecutor cannot even comment on it. However, Ken's attorney didn't raise an objection, and the judge didn't address it either. The prosecutor later claimed that he misspoke and intended to say, "if he doesn't know," rather than "if he doesn't tell us." But it was a significant slip. This mistake became the foundation for an appeal that John Edmonds filed. By that time, Tiffany and Tammy had long forgotten about Ken. They believed the case was closed and assumed that all prisoners filed appeals, but that they were usually of little consequence. However, this appeal would turn out to be different. In 2003, 1 year after Ken was convicted, the Supreme Court overturned the verdict. However, this did not mean that Ken was declared innocent. He was released on bail, but the charges against him were not dropped, and a retrial could start at any time. Once again, his lawyer, John Edmonds, turned to the case files and began to study them carefully. What he found shocked him. He discovered a huge oversight by the prosecution that had occurred even before the trial. In the Wakisaka couple's apartment, there was a young man living there who was not related to them. He was simply renting a room. The grand jury, before the trial had even begun, had requested that this young man be called as a witness. Normally, when a grand jury asks for a witness to be called, the prosecutor is obligated to comply. However, the prosecutor failed to call the witness, even though his importance to the case was undeniable, as he could have known more about what happened to Charlene. On the fateful morning of her death, the young man had been home, and the events unfolded before his eyes. What was even more intriguing was that, although the grand jury never heard his testimony, Detective Cambra had spoken to him. The young man told him that on the day of Charlene's death, she had asked Ken to stay with her because she wanted to die in peace. This indicated that indeed she had been contemplating death that day. However, the jury never heard this. Attorney John Edmonds returned to court with these new materials and won the case. The murder charge against his client was dropped. Ken Wakisaka was now not just released on bail, but fully free. However, he was not declared innocent. If he had been found innocent, according to the law, he could not have been tried again for the same crime. But as things stood, there remained a possibility of a retrial. Interestingly, there was another witness who knew both Cheryl and Ken. Marjorie Collier works as a manager of the apartment complex where the couple lived. Unlike Tiffany and Tammy, Marjorie knew for certain that it was Cheryl who was the instigator of all the arguments. Cheryl had once casually told Marjorie that Ken was her complete opposite. He never argued with her or raised his voice. In case of a disagreement, he would prefer to go outside for a walk to clear his mind. Cheryl didn't like that. On April 5th, when Tammy called an ambulance to their mother's house, Marjorie was also there at work. She spoke with the paramedics, who told her that Cheryl was conscious and fully aware of what was happening, enough to refuse to go with them. The paramedics' report noted that Ken had decided his wife didn't need to go to the hospital, but Marjorie was told by the paramedics that Cheryl had refused to go herself. Later, when Marjorie learned that Ken was accused of killing his wife, she couldn't believe it. She had her own version of what might have happened between the couple. Her assumptions were based on an incident that occurred when Cheryl came into her office. She was loud and insisted on being seen immediately. Marjorie had come to close the door since she hadn't started work yet. It was still early, but as she was closing the door, she accidentally hit Cheryl on the arm, causing her to spill a cup of coffee. Marjorie didn't think much of it until a police officer arrived and threatened her with arrest for assault. Cheryl had called the police. The woman claimed that the spilled coffee had burned her legs. But even the officer could see that one cup of coffee couldn't cause such severe burns on both of her legs, from her thighs to her feet. The only conclusion was that Cheryl had injured herself. She was willing to harm herself just to frame Marjorie. So Marjorie developed her own theory about how the woman had died. Of course, this is just her version, but she believes that Cheryl wanted to make it appear as though her husband had tried to kill her, but she went too far and ended up dying. However, of course, Cheryl's daughters could not be persuaded. They continued to demand a retrial, but the former prosecutor was no longer working in the office, and the new one was in no rush to move forward with the case. Confident that his client would again be accused of murder, attorney John Edmonds sought help from a well-known pathologist who firmly stated that Cheryl did not die from strangulation. The marks that were believed to be signs of strangulation were actually caused by the tubes that had been inserted into her mouth and had pressed against her throat during her 5 days in the hospital. In response, the new prosecutor hired other experts who, unexpectedly for him, confirmed that Cheryl had not been strangled. As a result, in 2010, the prosecutor's office announced that it was abandoning the strangulation theory, the very theory that had been used to charge Ken back in 2002. In an email to Cheryl's daughters dated January 22, 2014, the new prosecutor wrote that the district attorney had given the green light for Ken to be tried for murder resulting from criminal negligence. That is, they wanted to accuse him of failing to provide medical help to his wife, which ultimately led to her death. However, the case was never brought to trial. Attorney John Edmonds argues that this theory could be easily disproven, as Ken had indeed tried to help Cheryl by calling 911. There was also the issue of the pill bottle found under the bush near the couple's house. However, during the 2002 trial, Detective Canberra testified that on April 6th, after Cheryl was admitted to the hospital, he visited the couple's apartment in search of possible evidence, suggesting that the woman had intended to take her own life. Ken was at home and showed the detective a medicine cabinet which contained a white bottle with red pills. The detective did not seize it that day, but on April 8th, he was told that Tiffany and Tammy had found an empty bottle of medication under the bush. However, on April 6th, the detective had carefully examined that part of the yard and the bushes, and he was sure that no pill bottles had been there at the time. He was convinced that this was the same bottle he had seen on April 6th. This was intriguing, but in any case, the bottle contained anti-seizure medication, which Cheryl had been taking and which is sold without a prescription. However, a non-lethal amount of a completely different medication used to treat heart arrhythmias was found in her system. But even here, it would not be possible to prove that Ken was hiding something or trying to conceal evidence. On the contrary, when the paramedics arrived, he also showed them the medicine cabinet, where the medical staff counted the remaining pills in the bottle to determine how many she had taken. Moreover, the attorney could have proven that in the final days, Cheryl was emotionally unstable. Her doctor had prescribed her medication to help her cope with her emotional state and even wanted to admit her to a psychiatric clinic for treatment. Tiffany and Tammy were certain that within a couple of years the case would be brought back to court, but the years have continued to pass without any attempts to recharge Ken, and it remains unclear whether such attempts will ever be made. Meanwhile, the sisters continue to review all the case files in the hope of finding another clue. Their husbands and children often have to go without their wives and mothers, who are conducting their own investigation. But the women believe they cannot live peacefully without fulfilling the promise they made to their mother, a promise that has become an obsession, preventing them from veering off course.